Good afternoon, Robert Scribbler again. I am going to explore a couple of controversial topics. But before we start, I'd like to call your attention to the book over my right-hand shoulder, The Madhouse Effect by Dr. Michael E. Mann. We're going to be talking about Dr. Michael Mann a bit today, but even more so, we're going to talk about some of the misinformation that is promoted in some powerful media sources about climate change and global warming, and also talk about a few methods for countering that misinformation. So what we're looking on the screen right now is an article posted by the Wall Street Journal today, which states that the sea is rising, but not because of climate change. Now, at its face, this is a rather dubious claim, and from Michael Mann, we find that he's comparing it to a denial of the theory of gravity. Michael Mann says that the latest Wall Street Journal op-ed, "The sea is rising, but not because of climate change." Stay tuned for these great follow-up op-eds. Objects are falling, but not because of gravity. And continents are moving, but not because of plate tectonics. So here, Michael Mann is using sarcasm to debunk a climate change denial claim from the Wall Street Journal's op-ed page. Clicking on the Wall Street Journal, we find that the author of this dubious and anti-factual report is none other than Fred Singer. And basically, Singer here is stating that climate change is not the cause of sea level rise. He doesn't exactly say why it's not the cause. He also makes the odd claim that sea level rise is inevitable, pointing to red herrings such as land subsidence and whatnot. We're going to talk a little bit more about Fred Singer later, but let's just look at the facts. So going to the NASA page, we find that NASA states that sea level rise is caused primarily by two factors related to global warming: the added water from melting ice sheets and glaciers, and the expansion of seawater as it warms. So a pretty simple, basic scientific fact here. Sea level rising is caused by global warming and by these two mechanisms, which Fred Singer, in his quackish statement to the Wall Street Journal, attempts to refute. Now let's look at some other major scientific sources. The IPCC makes a similar statement, stating that global warming is the primary cause of sea level rise, and that thermal expansion, again due to warming, and glacier melt is the primary cause. And going on to the World Meteorological Organization, we find that sea level rise is also caused by global warming, thermal expansion of the oceans, and glacial melt. So an ongoing theme here among the major scientific bodies. The Met Office also states that sea level rise is caused by human-caused climate change, thermal expansion of the oceans, and you guessed it, melting glaciers. The Met goes on to talk about all the potential impacts of sea level rise, tens of millions of people displaced under certain scenarios, and the potential related costs in dollar values. So a brief overview of the science finds that no, Fred Singer is not telling us the truth. He's making what is clearly a contrarian statement, and for some reason the Wall Street Journal thinks that this FARC is important. Now let's look a little bit at Singer himself. Let's pull up. Let's see how much let's pull up DSmog blog here and look at what the research itself says about Fred Singer. So here we find that Fred Singer is trained in electrical engineering and physics, so he's not a climate scientist. And when we look at his background, we find that Singer is a founder of a group called the Science and Environmental Policy Project, which is focused on global warming denial, and that he receives $5,000 a month from the Heartland Institute, which is heavily funded by fossil fuel corporations such as ExxonMobil. So, going back to Dr. Michael Mann, we find that there is a very strong basis to support this climate scientist's claims that Fred Singer is basically making the ridiculous statement that is the climate science equivalent of refuting the theory of gravity. So, unfortunately, we see reports like these in the media every day. And what it does is it tends to spread doubt among people who don't take the time to do the research to find out what the sources are or what the science has to say about these claims. We see it typically as it relates to climate change, but we also see it as it relates to clean energy. And so I'm going to show you another example of a irresponsible media report. This one yesterday produced by Politico. And Politico published a report that provided a platform for the statements of one Jonathan Lesser, who claims that what I found is that widespread adoption of electrical vehicles nationwide will likely increase air pollution compared with new internal combustion engine vehicles. You read that right. More electric cars and trucks mean more pollution. And to this we say, bullshit. How can Politico in good conscience publish the blatantly false work of a pro-fossil fuel industry shill? EVs produce zero tailpipe emissions in use. They are 2 to 3 times more efficient than ICEs, and mated with wind and solar, they produce zero carbon emissions in use. So how can Politico in good conscience publish an article that claims that electrical vehicles increase air pollution? Well, let's go and take a look at what some of the science says. So according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, electrical vehicles are cleaner and cheaper than oil. Even when electricity comes from the dirtiest coal-dominated grid, electrical vehicles still produce less global warming pollution than their conventional counterparts, with fewer tailpipe emissions. So here you have an association of scientists that are stating that electrical vehicles are cleaner than conventional internal combustion engines. And what we find is that mile per gallon equivalence, which is a basic measure of both fuel efficiency and carbon emissions, what we find is that for electrical vehicles, mile per gallon equivalents are far greater than that of internal combustion engines, and that those fuel efficiency equivalents improve over time. So for example, if you look at California, an electrical vehicle would net you about 78 miles per gallon when connected to the California grid. And by 2016, that fuel efficiency level increased to 109 miles per gallon. So who is this guy who wrote this article for the Manhattan Institute? Well, in short, we find that he is funded by major fossil fuel investors. So there you go, the madhouse effect in action.